This topic analysis, I'll discuss the September-October resolution from the standpoint of more framework or philosophical positions. I'll first start by discussing some of the ground of what framework positions might look like on this topic, some of the central controversies, and then after that I'll segue more into specific strategic considerations for the affirmative and specific positions, and finally the same with the negative. So, as you know, this topic will be discussing whether or not that standardized tests ought to be considered for undergraduate education. But the most important thing to realize is that these types of discussions are never considered truly in a vacuum, but rather are much more often appeal fundamentally to various facets of educational theory, and consequently, what kind of underpins a lot of the history of education and the types of values that different philosophers and different educational theorists think that education should aim for. Education as we know it, starting through K through 12, or in some cases pre-K, has not always been that way, which is interesting. It's rather actually much more of a modern convention than anything else. Up until around the 1800s, education was mostly reserved to the wealthy, in fact, wealthy white male children, and families that were able to afford to hire private tutors or send their children into private schools was mostly the extent to which education existed. That the children of much poorer families or even the middle class were expected to mostly just pick up from their parents, maybe would go to school for a couple of years, and then following that would be expected to work. So much more extensive and comprehensive education is a fairly modern convention. It became much more universal in Germany during the late 1700s, early 1800s, as a means of ensuring that, of inculcating conformity and loyalty to the German government, to the monarchy, that it was believed to be an opportunity by which citizens could be made to have children could from a young age be taught fidelity, loyalty, and patriotism. However, as time went on, those values, and that was the first time that, in a very comprehensive sense, the children of peasants were educated because the purpose was to teach them to remain loyal to the government, and that was seen as a valuable thing to promote. But over time, throughout later on in the 1800s, the idea of, and into the early 1900s, the idea of education being solely a tool of conformity to ensure that people were loyal to the crown began to shift. In particular, educational theorists who came up with the idea of kindergarten and early education instead started to believe that what was more important was teaching free thinking and creativity. The idea of kindergarten itself was derived from the idea of an area of learning for the youngest children to be able to play with toys and be able to really begin to experiment as free thinkers, which was the first real divergence of thinking in terms of what education should prioritize. So this background is hopefully a useful introduction to some of the ideas of how education started, the real genesis of education, and I think more importantly as well, how some of this can shape the types of values that people ascribe to education. Whereas some viewed it as a means of ensuring conformity, whereas others view it as much more that pedagogy should center free thinking. And the parallel to standardized testing, I think, should be fairly straightforward. Those who believe in standardized testing tend to believe that the purpose of education is much more to ensure not is to ensure conformity to some extent. There is a test that students take and they submit it to colleges that often schools begin to teach to the test, and the goal of standardized testing is to emphasize a certain set of skills. In contrast, many people who are believers in in some of the downsides of standardized testing believe that instead the goal should be instead to ensure that there's creativity and free thinking instead of conformity, and they believe the standardized testing unnecessarily crimps creativity because the teachers are encouraged to teach to the test, to have a fixed curriculum, and as a result are much less likely to ensure free thinking. And many philosophers have discussed the merits of various approaches. For example, Kant, as I'll discuss in the negative positions, has emphasized much more that the purpose of education is to create a certain type of citizenry that because of the natural moral failings of many people, that has to be taught out of them, and as a result, the state has an obligation to emphasize certain forms of education that habituate good tendencies in citizens. Whereas other philosophers, for example, John Dewey or Aristotle, believe instead in much more of a free-flowing understanding of education. So we'll talk about some strategic considerations for affirmatives. These are more broadly strategic considerations that apply for framework debate. On the affirmative, there are really three main goals. The first is that the focus when you read a framework position should be on intentions and not the end result. This gets at the distinction between consequentialist and non-consequentialist theories. So consequentialists say, the ends justify the means. What matters is the end state of things. So for a brief analogy, it is okay for me to kill one person to save five, because five people dying is a lot worse than one person dying. And theories like utilitarianism appeal to much more consequentialist philosophical approaches. The framework affirmatives generally try to obviate more solvency-based or ends-based approaches, the reason being that you try to focus on a moral obligation that exists regardless of effect. The strategic reason for this is fairly obvious, that you want to be able to sidestep the same debates about solvency and efficacy that the AF often gets embroiled in. So, in short, to win, you don't want to have to win that the affirmative, that getting rid of standardized testing has an effect that is net better for students, because then you have to deal with likely a bunch of solvency dumps. You have to deal with a variety of counterplans that might solve better disadvantages that you want to be able to avoid via your ethical framework that is able to set up that there is some set of reasons why, even if the affirmative is not effective in a traditional consequentialist sense, that it is still a proper orientation towards the world. Which leads us into number two, that you don't have to demonstrate that you fix all of the problems of standardized testing. In fact, in my opinion, I think, with a lot of framework positions, you merely have to demonstrate that standardized testing is an improper orientation towards the world and is an inappropriate way for education to be structured. And that if you demonstrate that, it proves that you've met your burden. Standardized testing should not be considered. People will often make arguments maybe that standardized testing, you have to make arguments that demonstrate that colleges should do something else instead and some other way to quantify whether or not students deserve admission. I don't think that necessarily makes as much sense with a non-consequentialist framework. If your argument is really just about the way that education should be structured and the way that the state and educational system should be oriented towards their citizens, I think demonstrating that standardized testing is an improper orientation is more than enough. However, the fact that you're defending a more principled understanding of why standardized testing is bad need not mean you have to defend the whole resolution. There certainly is no reason why you could not defend particular subsets of the resolution via plans, specifying specific schools, specifying specific tests like the SAT or ACT are all possibilities. So now we'll go into the meat of some of the potential affirmatives that could be defended. There are two that really spring to mind to me. The first is a pragmatism affirmative. I'll briefly sketch out what the pragmatism framework looks like. So pragmatists do not appeal to some overarching ethical theory of the world. So utilitarians say the goal is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, and the ends justify the means, whereas deontologists say instead of much more of a focus on the intrinsic power of human rationality and agency and the ability to make choices, and use these to deduce sweeping ethical theories about the world. Pragmatists are quite different. They don't appeal to a consequentialist or non-consequentialist approach to how the world should look. Instead, it's much more of what's called a decision procedure, or a way to, in essence, just make decisions in your everyday life. Pragmatists believe that ethical theories, for ethical theory's sake, is pointless. The point of ethics is to guide our actions in the everyday world, and more importantly, the impetus for ethical theorizing is a problem-solution mentality. So, for example, if I'm currently doing work, and I'm in the Middle Ages, and I want to work at night, I realize I can't unless I have electricity, or maybe a candle in those days. I'm not as well read on my scientific timelines for electricity as I probably should be. So at that point, the impetus for deciding to, light a candle is you have a problem, you want to work at night, and are unable to, which leads you to a certain solution. You weren't thinking, I'm a utilitarian, I should therefore maximize the amount of pleasure I'm experiencing, but rather, here's a problem, I'm going to try to fix it. which means that ethical inquiries should always maintain that focus on what is practical or pragmatic, hence the label pragmatism. Uh, and as a result, experimentation, being able to iteratively and continuously revise your conclusions, is something that ought to be promoted. This must be flexible and free flowing. Some philosophers that write about this, Peirce, John Dewey, uh, James, these are some of the more common names you will see in the pragmatist literature. The way that this connects to the topic, I think, is fairly self-evident, that standardized testing, even if not mandatory, or even if it's not something that students necessarily have to do, is a way of assigning a cookie cutter approach to education. That is, students are told this is what you need to get into college, and as a result, it creates perverse incentives for teachers to teach to the test. The ways this plays out are very clear. So, for example, the Common Core curriculum was implemented as a way to ensure that students were basically learning the same material across the country, which funnels them into the test prep system, where College Board tries to get them to meet a series of objectives to perform well on the SAT or ACT. So even if college is no longer considering standardized testing, does not eliminate standardized testing or even eliminate Common Core standards, it would certainly go a long way to removing some of the incentives that are in place for teachers to teach to the test and for teachers to try to teach in a way that is that promotes conformity instead of experimentation. The teachers should have the ability to, formulate their own lesson plans, teach to each individual student. And I think that's an argument that a lot of negatives will make, which is that the AF doesn't fully solve because standardized testing will still exist, both via non undergraduate admission standardized testing and because college standardized testing still exists independent of colleges considering it. So while we can obviously debate the degree to which standardized testing goes away post-affirmative, I personally think it's very plausible to say that standardized testing would very likely not exist if colleges didn't consider it anymore. But I think the more important thing is, again, the AF does not have to win some ends-based solvency. If they demonstrate that standardized testing for colleges is an inappropriate way for education to be structured, the affirmative seems to have met their burden of demonstrating that it is in fact not a pragmatist approach to the world. The second is a libertarianism position. Libertarianism is a common political philosophy that basically argues the government should be non-interventionist, and the government needs to minimize the extent to which it interferes in the lives of citizens. So common proponents of this are, the most popular is Robert Nozick. So libertarians distinguish between what is called positive and what are called negative rights. Negative rights are your rights to non-interference. So, for example, I am not allowed to punch you in the face. I am not allowed to take your property. I am not allowed to light you on fire. I am, etc. Bodily injury or loss of property are negative rights, which libertarians believe should be defended. But they believe that's as far as the state should go in terms of playing a role in advancing the interests of citizens. That is distinguished from what are called positive rights, are not things that you should be protected from, but rather things you are proactively owed by the government. So libertarians have serious problems with people that believe in healthcare, a right to healthcare, a right to a job, the welfare state, even to some extent publicly funded roads, publicly funded infrastructure projects. So libertarians believe you only have a right to non-interference. They believe that taxation is a problem, and they believe that that it is stealing people's property because they are owed. They deserve their own money without the government interfering. Again, the ways this connects to the standardization of education, I think, is also fairly self-evident in that libertarians believe that the reason libertarians care so much about the protection of negative rights and not positive rights is because they believe that they know best, that individuals are the ones who should make decisions, not the government, and that standardized testing is a way for the government to impose a set of ideals about what education should look like on citizens. Once again, it's not that this is mandatory and that you don't have to take a standardized test, but rather that that public schools become structured around the fact that there is a certain set of educational norms that should be promoted and a certain understanding of what education should look like that is not one that allows parents and their children to have really their own say in how that education should look. That is, once again, teachers will teach to the test. Teachers will structure education around common core curricula and around a set of educational ideals that are passed along from the government to the citizens through a top-down mentality instead of a much more bottom-up one in which individuals, instead of the government, decide what education should look like. So now we'll segue into discussing negative positions and some broad strategic considerations. The first one is that counterplans are your friend. For the same reason that we identified that it is potentially threatening to the affirmative to demonstrate that the college consideration of standardized testing is not the make or break for standardized testing, or that like the affirmative does not fully address it. As the affirmative is trying to emphasize that consequentialist solvency doesn't matter, the negative should be demonstrating that it does. So a combination of reading several counterplans that prove there are other ways to fix the problems of standardized testing without wholesale elimination of standardized testing, and that, in fact, elimination of standardized testing might backfire, tend to be much better. So an example of this could be a counterplan that perhaps emphasizes that adds in extra flexibility into standardized testing, and then reads a link term that says, absent standardized testing, colleges will only consider GPA. That seems like a reasonable negative strategy against a more philosophical affirmative, because it proves that there are ways to fix standardized testing, to make it de-emphasize hyperconformity, to allow more freedom to teachers, but at the same time, there is a negative effect of a shift away from standardized testing, that focusing on something like GPA, once again, really instrumentalizes education. It becomes much less about learning for the sake of learning, but rather just trying to pass a test, just to learn things, just to do well in school. And then in some ways, GPAs can be more insidious because there's something that follows you throughout your entire high school, career, and that you are spending all aspects of your time in school trying to get the best grades possible. Whereas standardized testing is often a one-off thing. Once you take the test, the concerns about having to orient your learning around that are done. So in some ways, focusing on GPA might be even worse. And as a corollary to that, the third is that to frame it as a question of competing alternatives, not standardized testing good or bad. Again, the negative needs to demonstrate that the resolution is not just, are standardized tests good, but rather, should colleges consider them, and that colleges make decisions by weighing a litany of factors and doing cost-benefit analysis. That even if standardized tests are not ideal, if they are better than other alternatives, for example, consideration of GPA or consideration of extracurriculars, that the negative should be very willing to explain in the context of the affirmative's ethical theory why those other competing metrics are worse. So there seem to be two central negative positions. The first is a different flavor of pragmatism than the one that I outlined for the affirmative. So, as mentioned, many pragmatists emphasize the importance of being able to make very case-by-case determinations instead of sweeping ethical theories. So one flavor of pragmatism that many people in debate have had success reading emphasizes what people refer to as particularism, or the idea that because sweeping ethical claims are wrong, that it's important to make decisions on a case-by-case basis and avoid overly totalizing government policies or ethical statements. So in this case, the negative would argue that even if it is correct that standardized testing has been misapplied to create hyperconformity and remove individualism, the idea that across the board colleges should not consider standardized testing takes it too far. That there are situations in which standardized testing does make sense and ought to be considered an option. This position I don't think is particularly strong, the reason being that it's hard to ascertain what the bright line is for when something is particular enough, and this seems, I think, to go out the window if the affirmative specifies a plan. But against an affirmative that is willing to say sweepingly, standardized testing is unequivocally bad, this could make sense. The second option is much more of a Kantian NC. So there's a lot to say about Kant, but I think the quickest way to summarize this in short is that Kantians, in contrast to utilitarians, emphasize not that we should maximize pleasure and minimize pain, but rather that humans fundamentally, because they are human, have agency and rationality, that we make decisions about what's right and wrong about the world and rationally reflect about, given states of affairs, and that we respect other people as agents because of their fundamental human nature, and that as a result, we should never treat others as an end, treat others as a means to an end, but rather should always treat people as ends in themselves. So while a utilitarian says it's okay to kill one to save five, a deontologist or a Kantian would say, no, that's not okay, because you are using them. That even if they are net more people that are saved at the end, you are using that person in an unethical way. So one aspect of Kantian philosophy deals with its educational approach. Kant believes that people are naturally born to be evil and uneducated, that the process of moral habituation or creation of good virtues in people is something that happens over time, and that they're not just born into it, but rather they have to learn, and that the state indeed plays an active role in the melding of citizens in a particular fashion, and that the state is an obligation then to try to promote the best possible attitudes in all citizens. So the way this plays out then is that standardized testing should not be, there's no justification for eliminating standardized testing, that in fact it is justified for the government to try to play a formative role in the shaping of the attitudes of citizens and to play a formative role in the education of citizens. And as logically would follow, that it makes sense for this to be much more of a universal sweeping approach in that standardized testing, the College Board has a series of standards they believe that are educational, and they believe that a certain set of things that students need to have to be proficient in school, and that begins as early as the Common Core very often, and that students should be able to achieve those benchmarks in order to succeed, and that those are things that are necessary for an adequate education. And the government is justified in imposing those benchmarks because they play a role in determining how and where education should take place, and the most effective ways to create a valuable education for students. So as always, if anyone has any questions, definitely reach out to us and ask us about various approaches to the topic. There definitely seems to be some philosophical debate and educational theory about the most effective ways to educate students, and we look forward to hearing your feedback on all of this. Thank you.